All right, we have a very special guest on the show today. He is running to become senator of the great state of Ohio, JD Vance. Welcome to the show. How you doing, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's just start from the top. Um, what made you want to run to be senator?
Well, I guess, I've been talking about problems in the country, things that are going well, things that are going poorly for a little while now. And, the past year or so, I started to, well, not even past couple of years, I started to get the itch to stop complaining about it and to start doing something about it. And, the Republican senator from Ohio, because we've got one Republican, one Democrat, announced his retirement. And I thought to myself, it's a pretty good opportunity to get in the fight directly instead of just going on TV and complaining about this stuff all the time. But I mean, basically, I think the country's becoming a bit of a disaster, and I worry a little bit that my party, I'm a Republican, that we are so focused, and rightfully, on the problems of the Biden administration, the problems of the government, that we ignore the fact sometimes that it's very often the biggest corporations, the private sector multinationals, that are censoring conservatives, that are silencing people, that are making it harder for people to live the American dream because they're shipping jobs off to China. And I think if we want to be serious about the challenges facing the country, we got to go after both the bad policies of the Biden administration, but also a lot of these corporations that have gotten rich off the American nation, but aren't giving anything back to it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so in your view, what do you think are some of the most pressing issues facing our state and facing the country right now?
Well, I think the most immediate problem that we have is the crisis at the southern border. Because when you let's say 200,000, 250,000 people come across the country, across the southern border illegally, what that does is it just turns the entire country into a law-free zone, because so many of these people are living in the shadows. So you've got, the amount of heroin and fentanyl coming into our country from Mexico has gone up by about 400% in the past year. You've got sex trafficking victims. I was up, not too far from your neck of the woods. I was in Mahoning County, and a woman who works with child sex trafficking victims was talking to me, and she's just like, they've seen an explosion of people who are coming in, to Youngstown, Ohio, sex trafficking victims in Youngstown, Ohio. It's the craziest thing. I wouldn't have imagined that there would be actual sex slaves in some of our, medium-sized towns in the state of Ohio. But that's happening because what has happened is you've got, let's say these crazy criminals who are moving through Central America, and they see a kid and a parent who just wants a better life. And of course, who wouldn't want to come to America? If you live in Nicaragua, or you're a poor kid living in Mexico, why wouldn't you want to come to America to live a better life? But what they promise these parents is they're going to bring them into the United States safely, and those kids are going to have an opportunity to live a good life. And what they end up doing in reality is actually selling them into sex slavery. So the parents don't know what they're getting into. The kids think they're going to a better life, but the criminals are using this chaos to make everybody more miserable. And of course, if you're just a normal person living in Youngstown, of course, you don't want sex trafficking going on, especially with children in your community. But all of those people suffer because of what we're doing at the southern border. The other thing I talk a lot about on the campaign trail is, we used to be a country that made things. We used to be a country where, my grandfather worked in a steel mill for 35 years. My grandparents raised me because, my mom struggled with opioid addiction for a big chunk of my early life. And, my grandfather used to see things and used car lots or all over the country where he'd say, Armco Steel, which is where he worked, built that product. And now what happened is we let the Chinese make all the things that we need. So the things that we do need, the cost is going up like crazy. We're having a big inflation crisis right now in the state of Ohio. But then also a lot of middle-class workers, instead of making those things here in America, we're hiring Chinese slaves to do it. It's just bad for everybody, except, of course, for the Chinese oligarchs. So I think those are the two things I talk the most about, but I care about a lot of other stuff too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we're talking with JD Vance, who's running for senator from the state of Ohio. On the southern border and the issues with that, people, maybe people listening outside of Ohio wouldn't realize, that it does have a impact on us. There was a poll that came out recently. I forget where it came from, but there was a poll that said one of the states that are the most concerned about the southern border is Ohio. Residents in Ohio, because of a lot of what you talked about, with the issues with the drugs coming over and things like that. So, what, in your view, needs to be done to attack that issue, to address the problem that we're having at the southern border?
Yeah, I think it's not too difficult, actually. I mean, some political issues, right? Like I grew up in a community where a lot of dads weren't active in the lives of their kids. How do you solve the problem of fatherlessness? Like, that's a big and tough problem. Some problems, like the southern border, are a little bit easier. It's really about political willpower instead of figuring out what to do. And I was talking to a buddy of mine recently who's a journalist, and he's really interested in this country in Central Europe. It's a tiny little country of 10 million people. But one of the things that they do very well is they protect their border. And so he was over there, just doing some interviews with law enforcement and the people on the ground. And he actually saw them arrest an illegal immigrant and then walk the person over to their border and sort of put them on the other side of the fence and say, see you later, come back through the proper channels. And I think, how crazy is it that just doesn't happen in America, right? Where people come here illegally, there aren't law enforcement officials who are enabled and empowered to say, you know what, sorry, buddy, you're not allowed to be here. You're going to have to go on the other side, come back through the proper channels. Instead, what we do is we bring them into the country. We don't have any physical security for them, or at least most of the border is still pretty open right now. Donald Trump began to build a border wall, but it's still not complete. But what we can't do is, when people come across illegally, we can't just say, you know what, that's not going to work out. You've broken our laws. You're going to have to go back and come through the proper way. Instead, what we do is we bring them in, we give them a trial, and then we release them into the country before their trial even starts. And so most of them don't even come back. So there are all these immigration courts, especially in our southern border states, where there are like these hearings for illegal aliens who are supposed to, determine whether they have a right to be in the country or not. And of course, no one disputes that they don't have a right to be in the country. They came into the border, or they came into the country illegally. But instead of actually deporting them, the guys just don't show up. And so now they're like a permanent part of American society. There's no way to really track or control them. But I think it's basically simple, man. You finish the border wall, you enable the border patrol agents to do their job. And when people come in illegally, you don't have to be mean to them, but you can walk them across the other side and say, you know what, sir, you're not allowed to be here. You're going to have to come back the right way.
We're talking with J.D. Vance, who's running for the Senate from the great state of Ohio. Another thing that you touched on, that you talk about quite a bit, is the plight of the working class. That's something that is a passion of mine as well.
Sure.
So I just want to kind of explore that a little bit. Talk a little bit about where you see the issues that we're having in the country in terms of not being able to make things, and how we've had this breakdown really that has really hit the working class and lower middle class acutely in this country.
Yeah, it's all so complicated and interconnected, but I'll try to give a good summary of my views here. I mean, look, I think we've got what I describe almost as a spiritual crisis, that I saw growing up, where a lot of folks just looked to the future and thought, man, life is not going to be good in the future. It's not good right now. It's not going to get any better. And so there's a real hopelessness. I think some of this is that a lot of kids, especially young boys in working class communities, whether they're white or black or some other color, they grow up without dads. And we know that, I think it's just profoundly harmful for a young man, especially, to not grow up with a positive male role model. I think it hurts little girls too, but I think it hurts little boys especially. And you see some evidence that little boys are really struggling in school. They're more violent. They're dropping out more. They're getting into gangs and drugs and all the stuff that we don't want them to get into. And I think that starts at the home. Now, then you ask the question, well, why aren't there as many fathers in the homes? And again, that's a complicated question. But I think a big part of it is that we used to make it possible for young men to support a family. And we didn't tell all of them, if you want to have a good life, you've got to go get a 4-year college degree. You've got to go acquire a lot of this debt. You've got to, move to some far-flung city. we used to provide really good opportunities to people in the communities that they came from, or at least close by. And we didn't require everybody to get a college degree to enjoy those opportunities. And that's a big part of where the manufacturing decline in this country comes down to, because you think about Armco Steel, where I grew up, right? It had 10,000 employees when my grandfather worked there in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's probably now got about 1,500 employees. So those are 8,500 good paying middle-class jobs, mostly employing young men. And now they've just disappeared, right? So what do the young men get into? They're not going to work in the day and then providing for a family at night. They're getting into illegal activity. They're a little depressed about themselves. I'm sure you've seen this. I certainly have. Is when somebody doesn't have a job, they start to get down on themselves a little bit, and it just becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy of men dropping out of the workforce, dropping out of the family, young boys growing up without fathers in the homes. And I think that's a big part of why we have some of the problems we have in communities like mine.
Yeah, absolutely. I know as a child, and I wrote about this in Newsweek a couple of weeks ago. As a child, my mother worked at General Motors. And when her plant shut down, we went from being solidly middle class to poverty overnight. And it has a huge, huge impact. So what can we do to address that from an economic perspective? Obviously, like you kind of talked about, the cultural stuff is like it's complex and there's a lot of moving parts in that. But from an economic standpoint, what can we do to start to address that?
Yeah, I think to me, it really does start with jobs, right? There's, I'm definitely like, look, if somebody falls on hard times, they can't provide for themselves, they don't, can't put food on the table. I'm absolutely a fan of us as Ohioans and as Americans helping people out. But at the end of the day, if you want to provide long-term empowerment to people, you got to provide them with good jobs. They've got to have good opportunities. And, so I think the number one thing that we have to do is bring a lot of those manufacturing jobs that supported stable communities and strong families. We've got to bring them back to this country. It was not, people act like this was just some iron law of economics that we had to become a country that didn't make stuff anymore. That's not true. It was a policy decision. You listen to what leaders were saying 30, 40 years ago, and they basically said, yeah, we're going to lose a lot of middle class jobs, but we're going to get a lot of cheap consumer goods in response. And they were exactly right. They knew what was going to happen. So we got, stuff that's a little bit cheaper. You go to Walmart, you go to Target, and maybe you're getting, your Christmas toys for a little bit less. But the challenge is you've got hundreds of thousands, millions of people in this country who don't have middle class opportunities anymore. And I think that was a stupid trade for us to make as a society. We bring some of those jobs back. You get more people engaged in the type of wage, that's not just a scrape and buy income, but is an actual wage that can support a family. And I think you start to really repair some of the damage that was done. I also think that, we got to look at our welfare system and the way that it encourages people to stay single instead of getting involved in families and starting to build some real prosperity for yourself. So our welfare system, our tax system penalizes you if you get married. Why shouldn't it reward you if you get married? Why are we rewarding people for staying single, for not getting married to the mother or father of their kids? We should be doing the opposite. We should be rewarding people for that. So there are things that we can do, I think, to make this a country where, people who grow up without a silver spoon in their mouth can still live a good life. And I think, I'm a Republican. That's one of the things I think we should really be focused on in our party. We are increasingly, you go to a union hall. I was a union hall not too long ago, talking to people, and I was the only Republican candidate there. But what was crazy is over half the people in that union were Republicans. And I think that it says something about what the party can be and what it needs to represent when so many of the workers in this country are Republicans. We just have to do a good job of actually representing a lot of those voters, because I think, in the past, we haven't done a great job of it. We could do a lot better.
I'm actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that actually leads into my very next question. On that topic, one of the things that I see when we have this conversation about the working class, I don't see a ton of conversation about the Black working class. And what I've noticed from my background growing up, I grew up in a poor working class and lower middle class neighborhood that had Black and white people in it, is that what I've noticed is the Black working class have far more in common culturally with the white working class than they do with the Black or white elite.
Yeah.
And I think the Republican Party has an opportunity, if they're smart enough to take it, to be able to represent those people who go voiceless and anonymous in our system. It sounds like you see the same opportunity as well, but just kind of talk a little bit more about that. Expand on that.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk a lot about, and I think a fair amount about, is that a lot of the people that grew up. So Middletown, Ohio, where I grew up, is mostly a white working class town, but it's got a fair sized Black population. And the story of Middletown is that you had, when it became a real industrial powerhouse, and started to have some big manufacturing plants. The manufacturing plants recruited primarily Black people in the Deep South, and then a lot of white people primarily in the Appalachian Mountains. And so you got these people coming, mostly white from East Kentucky, East Tennessee, West Virginia, and then you got a lot of people mostly Black coming from the Mississippi Delta to work at these plants. And so there are a lot of folks in Middletown, Ohio, that but for the color of their skin, they think similarly to the way that I do. They even talk similarly to the way that my family did. Eat some of the same foods. Like I remember, one of the crazy things that happened when I was a kid is, it was in the 90s, and Tiger Woods had just won the Masters, and he was like this young up and coming athlete. He was, I want to say, a teenager, or maybe he was in his early 20s, but he was like, I think, the first Black guy who would won a tournament like that. And one of the other golfers said, made some sort of joke like, "What are we going to have for dinner tonight?" Because I guess they always have dinner after somebody wins the Masters. He said, "What are we going to have? Fried chicken or watermelon?" And wow. my grandma, I called her Mamaw. Mamaw got so pissed off, and she was so mad about that, and she was like, "Fried chicken and watermelon? That's our food. Screw that guy." It was like this thing, like, how dare she, or how dare this guy insult people who like fried chicken and watermelon? But there are all of these similarities, and what's interesting is that, a long time in American politics, say the 1930s or the 1960s, Black working class voters and white working class voters, they tended to vote together. And then they stopped for a long time. And I guess one of the things I think we have to do on the Republican side, because we've got the white working class, and I think we've got them solid, is start to attract, the Black and I guess now the Latino working class into our coalition. Because I think if we do that and we serve those voters well, like, we're never going to lose another election. We could become the majority party in this country for a generation if we actually see the opportunity. And what I tell a lot of my friends, who are a little older than I am, I'm 37 years old, is a lot of them will say, well, we really want to get back to country club set in the Republican Party. And I say, look, at the end of the day, like, we're going to be a stronger party if we accept that the country club set maybe is never coming back, but we acquire some of those Black and Hispanic working class voters into our coalition. Like, let the country club set go in the direction that, let them use their preferred pronouns and obsess about racial issues and gender issues, because they're all crazy. And I think this is like, this is something that actually unites a lot of working class white and Black folks, is we just want to live in a country where we don't have to obsessively worry about everything that we say. Like, these people are obsessed, meaning the professional class in this country, the elites, are obsessed with policing how other people talk. I just want to be able to talk about football or politics or whatever without worrying that some person on CNN is going to get pissed off with the way that I phrase something. I think that actually is there are a lot of people of all colors who feel that way.
Oh, I completely agree. We saw recently, the issues and stuff with Dave Chappelle. And
Absolutely.
I saw a lot of responses from what people call Black Twitter saying, "No, we ain't canceling Dave Chappelle."
That's right.
So I think you're right, man. I think people are tired of it, and it's because I always talk about the elites dominate the conversation, so they're having conversations amongst themselves, and in some cases calling themselves fighting on behalf of us, but they're supporting things that we don't even agree with. 80% of Black people don't support defunding the police. 80%.
Yep, that's exactly right. Do you remember when I think it was Kevin Hart was supposed to host the Oscars?
Yes.
And then they dug up some tweet and they ruined his life over it. They basically granted, he's a very talented guy, so I know he's still got a great career, but they really screwed that guy up over it. And I remember thinking to myself, like, if we're going to create a country where we attack everybody and destroy their livelihood for saying politically incorrect things, like, it's going to come for Kevin Hart and he'll be fine because he's a world famous millionaire comedian, but it's going to come for a lot of normal people too. It's going to come for like a middle-class factory worker who says the wrong thing and gets fired for it. And that's going to hurt, again, it's going to hurt white people, it's going to hurt Black people, but it's going to hurt anybody who doesn't want to toe the line and always watch what they have to say. Like, I served in the Marine Corps, one of the great, honors and privileges of my life. But like, if you had a video recorder and recorded what like me and my like, Puerto Rican and Black buddies in the Marine Corps were saying to each other, like, none of us would ever be able to live a normal life again. Right. But that's how normal people talk to one another. They're not, you can't build a real relationship with somebody, no matter what color of their skin, if you're constantly worried about offending them, or you're constantly worried that if you say something offensive, you're not even going to offend them, but somebody else is going to hear about it and try to destroy your life over it.
So what do we do to address that? Because I do actually believe, and some people like to act like it's trivial, but I actually do believe that that's a big problem for a number of reasons. One, from a Black perspective, you're having people advocating on, quote, our behalf, but they're saying things and representing things that we don't agree with. So from my perspective, our voices are being pushed out of the conversation by people who are like, here, shut up and let me help you. So I do think that there's a big problem with the issue of cancel culture. And so I think that's it's bigger than people really realize. It's a big deal. So what do we do to address it?
I think we try to get as many just normal people, and I use this word a lot, normal, because I just think, people disagree about certain things. They come from different walks of life. But if you're like a good, honest person who's not trying to destroy a person's life because they said the wrong thing or they think the wrong thing, you're a normal guy. And what I try to encourage people in politics, at least, and certainly in business, is we should try to create enough opportunity for normal people to actually rise through the ranks. I mean, look, if you're a crazy, wild-eyed, white liberal who, went to 2 Ivy League schools and you call yourself a defender and a representative of Black people, and you advocate for policies that 80% of Black people disagree with, like, the problem is, you're an idiot. But the other problem is there's not enough of a voice on the other side pushing back against it, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, this is one of the reasons I was excited to do this podcast. But I think we just have to elevate the normal people, right? Like in whether we agree with them on all the things politically or not, we should be, like Dave Chappelle, he's a normal guy, right?
Yeah.
It seems like he's more liberal than I am, but he's a normal guy.
An Ohio guy too.
An Ohio guy, yeah, not too far from where I grew up, actually.
Whoa.
But he's from Southwestern Ohio, or at least he lives in Southwestern Ohio now. I think that's kind of my answer to it. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to run for political office, is because there aren't a whole lot of people in the Republican or the Democratic Party who have a little bit of a perspective and some experiences and come from a community like the one that I came from, And so I think if we get as many of those voices out there, it'll make the whole conversation a little bit more sane. And then I think, once we actually get elected and once we reach positions where we can make a difference, then I think we have to remember where we came from. And when we're passing legislation, we need to pass legislation that gives people a little bit of space to actually, do their thing and speak their mind, and ensure that you're not getting fired for not doing things that other people want you to do.
Yeah, it's funny too, and we're talking with JD Vance, who's running for Senate, and we have a few minutes left. But I see sometimes some of the responses from the mainstream media of some of the things that you say, and they're like kicking your ass, and I hear stuff, and I'm like, it doesn't seem outrageous to me. Like a lot of the things that you talk about seem pretty normal and rational to me. I'm like, so is it something wrong with me, or because I'm like, they just go off, and I'm like, well, I don't see the big deal.
Yeah, well, that's good. I'm glad you don't, because I don't either. The thing that I try to remind myself is that the media, and I what they call a mainstream, I've started to use the term the corporate press, because I think, when Jeff Bezos buys up the Washington Post, and if you look at really who controls our media, there's a really strong connection between like America's multinational corporate sector and the media that they bought and controlled. But anyway, the corporate press, I think you have to understand, they're dominated by the people that I think have too much power and too much control over our society. Like, look, if you live in the Upper East Side or in Brooklyn in New York City, and you work in media or you work in finance, you have benefited from the offshoring of American jobs and the destruction of communities like mine. So it's not surprising that when somebody comes along and is trying to actually stand up for those people, for my people, you're going to react negatively to it, because I think I'm throwing in your face the fact that your agenda has been a failure and your ideas have not worked for most people. And that's why I say you got to elevate as many normal people as possible, is because, the media does not even try to be objective anymore. And I think most of them, they are so caught up in this very globalized, anti-worker, anti-normal person attitude, that whenever somebody comes along that's even a little bit of a threat to their power, they just pounce on them, they just attack them. And so I take it as a bit of a badge of honor. I've been in the public eye for 4 or 5 years now. I've sort of gotten used to the fact that people attack me and say things about me. And the thing that I think you got to do, or at least I try to do, is just, brush it off a little bit, remember where I came from, and not let it sway me in one direction or the other. Just be who I am, because, this is a big sacrifice for me. Like, I'm running for U.S. Senate. I want to be, your senator. I want to be the senator for everybody in the state of Ohio. And, I have to give up my business. Assuming I win, I'll have to give up my business. I have to give up a lot of really good things that are happening in my life. I don't get to see my kids as much. And I really, they're 4 years and 18 months old. I really love them. But it's only worth it if I'm going to make a difference. And I'm only going to make a difference if I'm willing to piss the right people off.
I like that. I know we have a minute left, man. We could talk forever on a lot of these topics. Let everybody know how to follow you on social media, how to learn more about your campaign, how to get involved if they want to, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So campaign website is jdvance.com. People can go there, learn more about my issues, learn more about what I care about. Follow along. I think we post our events on that website too. So if you're in a neighborhood where we're coming to do an event, you can come out and meet me in person. But thanks for having me. I hope we can do it again soon. And everybody who's listening, please vote for me, because that's the only way we're going to win.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much once again for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. We have to do this again for sure.
Yeah. Thank you.